In this episode of the Encounter Report, 3 cat owners consider adoption in Persona 5. There's Axelrod, your humble narrator who did a blind playthrough on easy difficulty, Krayson, our marathon runner who played the game blind on normal difficulty, and Ghost VTS, our difficulty diplomat who played the game blind on hard difficulty. Everyone played the game on the PlayStation 4, and with all that out of the way, let's see if there's any takers for some bossy cats. We're opening up with battle types to help set the stage, as each of our difficulty choices played an interesting role throughout the game. Boss fights make up one of the largest differences between our playthroughs, as Ghost VTS had a 40% death percentage across 20 encounters he engaged in. Krayson had a similar outcome at 37%, but boss fights also accounted for 50% of his total deaths across the game. Boss fights tended to be very manageable on my end thanks to easy difficulty, as random and story encounters accounted for the entirety of my deaths. For reference, I labeled 12 fights as boss encounters, which include all of the 7 palace end bosses, Shido's Phase 1, the Cleaner, Goro Kechi, the final Holy Grail fight, and Yaldabaoth. All enemies that would be labeled as mini-bosses were added as story encounters, and any Mementos Change of Heart encounters were labeled as optional if they weren't required to progress the main story. For battle locations, I figured separating Mementos from the other palaces would create a little more narrative, especially considering dungeon encounters are the only encounters in the game. For Ghost VTS and myself, we managed to have the same number of dungeon encounters, but due to his higher difficulty, the time taken to go through all of them is significantly increased. For reference, the average encounter length for dungeons was 1 minute 48 seconds for myself and 2 minutes 30 seconds for Ghost VTS, while Krayson came in at 1 minute 27 seconds. Krayson also manages to have a significant amount more dungeon encounters than the rest of us, but his run percent is only 5%, so something else is going on here, which we'll get to in a moment. The other interesting dynamic here is the amount of Mementos encounters. Despite feeling like I would put the least amount of effort into the place, to the point where I didn't even do most of the change of heart requests like Krayson and Ghost VTS did, I had the most. Krayson effectively went into Mementos whenever he had a request, and Ghost VTS staggered his entrances when he had multiple requests to do. Going into this, I really thought Mementos would play a significantly larger role in the encounter totals, but it was tamer than I expected. With combat types, our difficulty choices continue to put an interesting spin on things. Krayson had the most encounters, but running away had little to do with it, while Ghost VTS somehow managed to never run away from a single encounter. I'm unsure if he would rather go out fighting, forgot about the option, or something else, but he never seemed to entertain it. Even the people in his chat never broached the idea. Our deaths also scale drastically as the difficulty increases, to the point where one could possibly say each difficulty is twice as tough as the previous one. While I had my fair share of close calls, they pale in comparison to Krayson and Ghost VTS, who sometimes had to claw back from certain doom after a string of attacks. For subtypes, we finally get some clarity on why Krayson's encounter numbers are higher compared to the rest of us, and it's because he engaged in a lot of grinding. Admittedly, his choice of grinding was very unorthodox. 48% of it was done in Kamoshida's palace, which was the very first one of the game, 12% in Madarame's palace, and the remaining 40% in Kanashiro's palace. We will see how that compares to everyone else later, but the impact was definitely less than one would have hoped. For Ghost VTS, we can see a staggering 26% of his side quest fights ended up in death, and that was largely due to some of the fights being very highly tuned for his level. Interestingly enough, he was never the highest level throughout the majority of the playthrough until the final 4 random encounters. After realizing how much experience they provided, he grinded 3 encounters and snagged 2 additional levels, which allowed him to take the lead. Lastly, the amount of advantage encounters is quite high. Every one of us managed to achieve an advantage on at least 50% of encounters. In fact, if you exclude encounters that can't be ambushed, my advantage percentage goes up to 76%, Krayson to 63%, and Ghost VTS to 72%. Every one of us were doing well on palace encounters, but Mementos fights made them much more difficult to acquire. Next, we have notable locations, and since Persona 5 has a different approach to its dungeons, we're going to be showcasing all of them, starting with the palaces. This time around, I also tracked the amount of experience and money gained in battles, but there is a caveat or two. The first is that this counts all encounters, so if you do 5 encounters and die, those encounters that were erased from the death are still counted here. The second is that this only counts the experience and money provided from the results screen. Any money earned from confused enemies, negotiations, or other means were not included. Now, a while back, Crayson and I had a brief discussion about the weights of encounters, or how valuable an encounter is at what portion of the game. His early grinding excursion reminded me of that, as Crayson's reward for grinding so early didn't feel worthwhile in hindsight. The options to spend the extra money were limited, and the extra experience he gained pales in comparison to the other palaces, and worst yet, the effort it took. That said, each palace has its own little quirks that seem to point to what is best. Kamoshida's palace was one of the longest for Crayson and myself in total time spent in encounters, but actually ranked pretty low for Ghost VTS. One of the reasons for this, as well as some of his swift times in Madarame's palace, was due to the usage of DLC personas. He didn't shy away from using a level 90 in the first two palaces when the need arose, and when he fought Madarame himself, he used it to bypass one of his most challenging fights. From this point forward, he discarded the level 90 but kept Kaguya for the rest of the game, which proved instrumental. For the bosses themselves, each one of us had different struggles. Myself being on easy difficulty, Sai Nijima proved to be one of the most challenging, and was one of the more drawn out fights for me. Not many fights in of themselves managed to deliver many character deaths either, so it was a very smooth ride for me. Crayson, on the other hand, had one of my favorite coincidences leading up to Madarame's fight, as someone in his chat expressed displeasure in the mechanic of Joker dying meaning a game over. Crayson had disagreed and explained his reasoning, and then entered the Madarame fight, where Joker subsequently suffered a cheap shot 4 times in a row. That moment aside, none of the bosses stood out too much on a difficulty scale for him, as he was able to push past them. Ghost VTS, on the other hand, didn't meet his first wall until Akumura. The constant respawning of enemies alongside a timer really seemed to rush his decision-making, forcing him to swap the difficulty down to easy for that fight alone, racking up a total of 7 encounters. Every other fight would prove to go over relatively smoothly as his confidant ranks went up, which would help prevent any cheap shots. On the Memento side of things, I have to reiterate that it didn't take nearly as much time as I expected it would. I was the only person among us who neglected it, so it came as a surprise when I needed to reach the bottom with no idea when it would end. Thankfully, I was able to avoid most encounters and run away from the others. Crayson and Ghost VTS managed to reach the bottom before the requirement and reaped far more value from it. In fact, they both managed to acquire a hefty amount of money from the Shadow Odo fight by confusing him. They both gained hundreds of thousands of money, and it provided a nice boost. We have party composition next, and each one of us was a believer in Makoto, but the other 2 slots varied. Joining Joker and Makoto, I had Ryuji and Anne, while Crayson had Morgana and Anne, but Anne was swapped out for Haru once she joined his party. Ghost VTS managed to splash in several substitutes, as Yusuke would prove to be a staple while Ryuji would be swapped out for Haru, who would then be swapped out for Ryuji. Morgana and Anne also made a few appearances here and there, but they were brief. And to cap everything off, here's the final combined stats. This delve into each of our separate playthroughs, which also happen to explore 3 separate difficulty options, certainly shows there's a challenge to be had if you want it. That said, despite our varying approaches and VOD times, our encounter percent is pretty close. As a small added addition, I also tracked all-out attacks for each battle. I had a total of 390 used across 327 encounters, or 43% based on the grand total of encounters. Crayson had 334 total across 281 encounters, or 31%. Ghost VTS had 614 total across 460 encounters, or 63%. For usage in dungeons, the most I had was 57 in Akumura's palace, while Crayson had 49 in Kamoshida's palace. Ghost VTS had 90 in Akumura's palace and 87 in Shido's palace. And with all that said, that's all there is for the Persona 5 Encounter Report. I hope you visit everyone's channels and social media to praise them for all this wonderful data. With another report done, we can check the ad to adopt this bossy cat. Really? Nobody is interested? It's a talking cat! Thanks for watching, appreciate it, see you on the next video.